All right, so let's get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us as we kick off our Fair Housing Week at Orange County Realtors. I am your 2020 president, Lori Namazi, and it is my pleasure to introduce this first annual Fair Housing Week to everyone. And we look forward to many engaging conversations and lots of education this week. So I am thrilled that you are here, and I'm very excited to once again have the opportunity to chat with our guests today. We have some guests from other associations, so would like to thank the Newport Beach Association of Realtors and the Laguna Board of Realtors for joining us today, as well as many others across the state. So it is my honor to introduce our distinguished panelists that we have here today. So let's first start with Brian Green. Brian is Vice President of Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors, where he oversees all legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of the association's 1.4 million members. Brian joined NAR in November of 2019 and spent his first year at NAR raising the association's profile in Washington and nationwide on all fair housing related policy matters as NAR's first director of fair housing policy. Before joining NAR, Brian served for 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Employment, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of the 600-person office enforcing the nation's housing anti-discrimination laws. Brian was the 2007 recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. Brian earned his degree in government from Harvard University. It is such an honor, Brian, for you to join us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lori.
We also have joining us Matt DeFanis. Matt served as the 2020 chair of NAR's Professional Standards Committee, where he advanced a series of proposals that ultimately resulted in the addition of Standard of Practice 10-5 to the NAR Code of Ethics, a prohibition against realtors engaging in discriminatory hate speech. Matt is the 2021 chair of the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board. He served as the 2018 president of the Illinois Realtors. During his first 4 years on his state leadership team, he gradually became aware of the industry's persistent shortcomings in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he committed himself to improving it. Matt has since won numerous awards for his work on fair housing and inclusion in the industry. Matt works full-time with his clients in his home market of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where he leads a high-producing team and is broker-owner of Remax Realty Associates. Matt and his wife, Angel, have 2 teenage children, Gabe and Izzy. We're so pleased to have you with us here, Matt. Thank you both.
It's good to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, you guys. So we're going to have a great conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. And Brian, we're going to start with you. So tell us how your background and prior experience at HUD prepared you for a career at NAR.
Sure. Well, I suppose you're in the belly of the beast there. A lot of people don't fully understand everything that HUD does. Many see the agency as an anti-poverty agency, and it definitely has elements of that in its mission, but it's much broader than that. We provide the community development block grants to communities all across the country. We provide the FHA loans or insure the FHA loans throughout the country. We do fair housing on behalf, and I say we, when I was there, on behalf of all Americans. So it's not public housing or assisted housing. When I was at HUD, we addressed complaints from multimillionaires who face discrimination in the purchase of luxury housing. So HUD's mission was very broad, and I spent not quite 3 decades there. And I started as an investigator out in New England communities in a car going everywhere, mobile home parks to condominiums, anywhere you can imagine, up and down the New England coast, and then spent the last 10 years overseeing that part of the agency. So I feel as if it prepared me very well to understand certainly our fair housing challenges, but also how fair housing intersects with other housing policy, the other housing policy that HUD plays a key role in.
What a fascinating background. It's really neat to kind of hear where you came from and all of the different avenues that you were able to work in that led you here with us.
Thanks.
So can you provide some historical perspective on discriminatory actions taken by NAR and private industry and government agencies, and explain the impact of those actions on communities today?
Sure. So, as you all know, NAR President Charlie Oppler apologized last year for NAR's role in promoting discriminatory housing and helping to cement segregation in many of our communities. And, I would say overall, many people said, great, this is what we need to acknowledge in order to move on. But then there were many who said, oh, this is giving realtors a bad name, and why are we dredging this up? What do those bad actors from back in the day have to do with who we are now? And I think it's that conversation, what does the past have to do with now, that we really should unpack more. Because I think, one, there's a fundamental misunderstanding. We aren't talking about bad actors. We're talking about an entire housing finance system that was based on race. And I think many people still don't quite get that, and how recent that was, and how it's shaped this country. It was unethical to treat people fairly based on race. It was ethical to discriminate. You had to discriminate. You had to exclude people from communities to be a part of the National Association of Realtors and a realtor in good standing. So it's as blunt as that. And our government then, because NAR, unfortunately in Chicago, where its forerunner was founded, actively promoted racially restrictive covenants after a Supreme Court decision saying, yeah, discriminatory ordinances to keep minorities out of communities, that's unconstitutional. But private agreements, and covenants, that's okay. And so NAR took that, I want to say it was 1926, 1927, and up where Matt is in South Shore, began, not where he is now, but he actually grew up in the south side of Chicago. But in those communities, his family grew up in the south side of Chicago, I know now. In those communities, they openly advertised and advocated covenants. And then also out of Chicago, University of Chicago adopted those covenants for our housing finance system, for the making of mortgage loans. And that became official government policy based on the recommendations of an expert there at University of Chicago. And that became the legacy for our industry until I was born. And then the Fair Housing Act passed. NAR, we opposed that passage as well. So that's the past that we are trying to overcome, and a recognition that yes, the law has changed, but we still have some of these practices because this was the foundation of our housing finance system. So it takes work to undo it. I think the association has come a very long way in undoing it. I mean, the mere fact that we have this fair housing policy director position that I encumbered until I became the VP for policy, says a lot. And I think NAR has been moving in this direction for a very long time. But it's that history that is critical to understanding why both discrimination persists in many of our markets and why we have these inequalities in terms of wealth in our society.
It's been very eye-opening for so many of us in the last 2 years to learn about these things, to understand that this really was the history, and that our industry was so intertwined in the actual discrimination and prevention of human beings from moving into certain communities. And it is still affecting us today. And so can you elaborate a little bit more? You talked about the history of it, what happened, but how is that still impacting us today in terms of what that did to the potential generational wealth?
Yeah. So, one, you just couldn't buy a house. So we hear about the GI Bill, and that was rather significant in that African American World War II veterans came back, and they were on paper they were eligible for the GI Bill, but because of the practice of redlining and exclusion from communities, they were unable to use it because, and it was intentionally set up so that you had to, actually identify the house in communities before you can use the GI Bill. And so with rampant discrimination and redlining, African Americans could not move into the suburban communities that the country developed and subsidized. I mean, we subsidized it with highways, federal financing for all the subdivisions. I mean, we largely rebuilt America in those years and excluded people. So you hear a lot about the example of Levittown as a model community for returning veterans. African Americans could not live there, and still, I want to say they are in the single digits, maybe the lower single digits of people who live there. But those homes greatly appreciated for those veterans who had very little and were supported by the federal government. African Americans, for lack of a better term, had to often move into what they called slum housing, and just poor conditions because they were shut out of places. And you certainly don't gain any equity there. And then, that, as you point out, leads to intergenerational disadvantage. I actually think what's remarkable is how well many people of color have done, despite those institutional challenges. But it also means that when you have segregation, even those communities where you could buy, I think of many of these middle-class African-American communities, those homes still were not appraised at the prices that other communities were. And so there was less equity to tap to send children to school or help you out of a hot spot, and certainly less money to pass on to future generations. And then, so it basically has created a much more tenuous situation for many people of color. And it's not just African Americans, but many people of color who were excluded from communities or could only live in communities that were devalued. So that today in a housing market that's, it's very costly, means that, even when people have good credit and otherwise are qualified, they can afford a lot less. And it's not just about income, it's about the wealth over generations in housing.
It's an important point you bring up about the appraisals, because I think a lot of people will think there's overt discrimination and they don't recognize that there are many other ways that discrimination can happen. And the issues that we read about in the last year regarding appraisals, is just another space where this happens. And a lot of people just don't think about that. If they are the agent and they didn't discriminate, then there's this potential thought process that, well, nothing happened. We got this far, nothing happened, nothing else will happen, and that's not the case.
Yeah, and even in subtle ways, people perpetuate this. I mean, in the New York Newsday Fair Housing Expose that came out in November of 2019, you heard agents frequently talk about resale value in conversations with whites, and not as much, say, in those conversations with people of color. And so even if people aren't explicitly telling people, avoid these neighborhoods because of the racial composition, they are steering people to certain communities, or some people to certain communities, saying this is where you want to live because there's high resale value, but then with others not saying the same thing, perhaps not wanting to denigrate the neighborhood, but clearly establishing a different standard for who's concerned about resale value versus others, and potentially perpetuating that process.
I was in a
So
meeting.
if I may, I have a quick comment to add to that. And it's actually a story about one of Brian's former subordinates. I don't know if he's heard from me before or not. As a white guy, I can tell you this stuff does not happen in my field of view. It doesn't. It never has. And so the problem is my senses are telling me it's not happening. And it took me a long time to figure out through close friendships with people who don't look like me that it's not happening right within this field of vision. And as I was learning about this sad history, I'm from a Big Ten research university community, very progressive. And I thought, gosh, that's terribly sad. That's tragic. That's awful. Good thing that would never happen here. We wouldn't do that sort of thing here. And then, Brian, I was speaking at a fair housing event in Chicago, and Kimberly Nevels approached me. And Kimberly heard me say I was from Champaign. She had gone to the same high school I went to. Her mom was a dearly beloved guidance counselor. And Kimberly said, oh, yeah, this is somebody who works for HUD. Fair housing, is in the fair housing business, black female attorney. She said, Champaign is where I experienced my first housing discrimination.
Yeah.
She said, time after time, she said, I don't sound black on the phone. And time after time, I would call, confirm the availability of apartments. And then when the black woman showed up in person to view them, time after time after time, they were not available. And so, not number one, it was just crushing to hear it from somebody who's in my age range, from my hometown, from the same school. And number two, it just left me with this very sad realization: there is no place that is too good for this to happen. This happens everywhere, all the time. And I'm just here to tell you that because you can't see it, doesn't mean it's not happening all the time.
And I think the big problem is trying to figure out precisely why, right? I mean, I say that and people think, oh, well, don't be naive. But that's not, I'm saying it is a complicated question, because not everyone who engages in these practices, probably not everyone who, turned away Kimberly, thinks of themselves as disliking Black people. But sometimes people just don't see the person in front of them, right? And so, we know all about Kimberly and her background and, her qualifications, but many people are just misjudged, and many people just aren't even thinking about how they're misjudging. Some are, and some are just making assumptions that, people can't qualify, or they're wasting their time. And you see sometimes that attitude. And they don't necessarily think that's racist, that they're making assumptions based on people's background. But we do have to explore this better to sort of understand what is happening, because, when you look at the classic testing situation, where government agencies or private fair housing groups send people to evaluate how folks are treated, you see case after case where the objective criteria for the person of color is slightly better than the other person's, than the white person's. And agents still, don't believe their eyes. They decide to go with, the other person. And so that, when we're talking about just day-to-day discrimination, that's a tough nut still to crack. We're trying to address these things through implicit bias training, insofar as people are unaware that they're doing it. But if people are aware and they're just disregarding the numbers or the facts, that's a tougher issue.
Very true. And you brought up the Newsday expose, and Matt mentioned the experience that Kimberly had in your own hometown. And the reality is, this expose could have really been filmed anywhere. And I believe the outcome would have been very similar. So,
I think to Brian's point, I don't think the realtors you watch the hidden camera videos, there's no question there's disparate treatment. I don't think, with at least one exception, but I don't think most of the realtors intended to do it. I don't think most of them knew they were doing it when they were doing it. And I don't think they knew they had done it after they had done it until they were watching the tape back. And that's just how insidious implicit bias is. You literally don't have a consciously discriminatory thought in your head, and yet that's what autopilot in our brains will lead us to.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that we would like to hope that we wouldn't do that, but the reality is it can be done by any of us. And I was listening to one of our leaders from NAR who made a statement that said the people in that expose were our peers and our colleagues. And that really struck me because aside from that one comment, most people were saying them, those agents, as if they were the bad ones. They are our peers and our colleagues, and really they're a reflection of us too. And so it opened all of our eyes as it should have. So Matt, you talked about the experience you had with listening to Kimberly and your own experience of not initially recognizing what may be going on around you. You were very vulnerable and honest with us last year in moving forward the Standard of Practice 10-5 proposal, and you shared a lot of stories with us, your own personal experiences of listening to your friends and your colleagues and your family, but also those of some really hard stories to listen to from your colleagues. Can you tell us, a little bit more about that and how that really motivated you to make a difference?
Sure. So really by happenstance, I had this life-changing journey during the handful of years that preceded happening to be positioned in what is normally a relatively quiet, low drama lane of NAR, which is pro standards. So there I am sitting under my umbrella in a lawn chair and got run over by an issue that I would never have foreseen. But it was really because of the experiences, just as I said, by happenstance from the preceding few years. And when the issue of discriminatory hate speech by realtors came up and multiple state and local leaders wrote to then President Vince Malta asking for better tools to address it, because at that point, there were very, very imperfect tools for addressing it in very rare sort of one-off instances. And my concern, to be totally candid, was I was chair of a committee of over 100 members representing every state in the country. It's big, it's slow moving, it's very white, and it's fairly old. And my concern was, will I be able to galvanize a committee with this demographic composition to treat the issue with the seriousness that it really needs? And so NAR has since published this. I'll put a link in the chat box, but I started our special meeting on June 29th of last year, the full committee meeting. I started it with a 90-minute conversation on race and real estate. And the idea was I had learned, and still reeling from the realizations, but I had learned in those preceding couple of years just how appallingly different selling real estate while Black remains from what I experienced selling real estate while white. So I asked 5 Black colleagues from around the country who are all good friends and I had banked some trust and goodwill with. My ask of them was basically, would you be willing to come participate in a no holds barred conversation? No preconditions, nothing off limits, no idea what I'm going to ask you because I don't know what I'm going to ask you. And I'd like for you to bare your souls for the enlightenment of a bunch of old white people. Sound like a plan? And they all said yes. Now, I knew that was a big ask when I made the ask. What I was not fully prepared for was to call on a specific moment, Joanne Poole, talking candidly about an experience that's happened multiple times, not daily, not weekly, but multiple times in modern history where she's literally been left out on the doorstep. Your white clients can see the house. You, the Black realtor, will wait outside. And I was very, very close to losing it just listening to her say it. I knew it was a big ask to get those folks to come in and basically bare their souls for the enlightenment of a bunch of white people. But I felt really guilty that because of that request, Joanne Poole had to go back to a mental place that was required to retell the story. And my request to NAR staffers, because it did, in fact, the conversation did, in fact, galvanize that pro standards committee. The Maya Angelou adage, when you know better, you do better, played out that day. After those 90 minutes, and I one of the things that's forever etched in my mind is the Zoom gallery view, and I'm watching committee members physically recoil in shock and horror at what they were hearing is the everyday life of Black realtor colleagues. And to their credit, after 90 minutes of that, the best way to describe the sentiment was pissed off. They were ready to pull any lever of power that was within their reach to make that they had just spent the last 90 minutes listening to. They were willing to do anything to make that stop. And that's kind of what kicked this all off. And so once they knew better, and I don't say this to sound surprised, but once they knew better, they were very much ready to make sure that we as an organization, we as an industry did better. So then 5 in the weeds meetings with the more specialized wordsmithing group, the Interpretations Procedures Advisory Board, then another full committee meeting, and then on to the board. But the board meant another group of hundreds and hundreds that hadn't sat through all of these experiences. And so my request to NAR staff was, I want that race conversation. I want it edited. I want it distilled. I want it concentrated. I want it weaponized, and I want it deployed on that board of directors, because I am not ever asking Joanne Poole to go to that place in her head again.
It was so powerful. And even just hearing you talk about it now reminds me of the moment I saw the video and then the moment I heard you present along with others. But you truly were the voice at that time, and it was the right voice at the right time. So we thank you for that. I know that it has been something that has truly been a labor of love, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for a lot of people to really make sure that we could hear the stories, because that's what it takes. What we see on the news is horrible enough. When we hear it from people we know, it's so powerful. And so tell us a little bit more about 10-5. We do have a full training on 10-5 later this week. We'll make sure that the link for registration is in the chat. But if you can just give us the quick version of it for our audience, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so the issue was discriminatory hate speech by realtors, which was if it was happening in their jobs, if it was happening in the confines or context of real estate related work or transactions, it would have already been against the rules. You would have already been running afoul of Article 10, and you would have also been probably running afoul of various other fair housing obligations. The real issue was realtors doing this on their personal time. And, you talk to most realtors and somebody can claim to be clocked out and being a rampant keyboard bigot on social media on their personal time, except you ask them how long, or you check and see how long it takes them to clock back in if a hot lead comes in the door. And ultimately what we decided as a group was, once you're a realtor, you're always a realtor. It's not like the beginning of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood where you come home, you shed the realtor sport coat and you put on the private bigot cardigan. And once the private bigot cardigan is on, it's okay. I can be a flaming racist on social media, but don't worry, that in no way interferes with my ability to live up to the letter and the spirit of my Article 10 obligations by day. That is not, it's not believable. It's not plausible. But more importantly, if a realtor does that in their private life, they have still just shrunk the availability of real estate services to the consuming public, because you won't ever know what consumer never crossed your threshold at your office, at your real estate office, that next day, that next week, that next month, because you just alienated them and shrank the universe of housing services. NAR's current mission is to promote, protect the right to real property for all people. This discriminatory hate speech was an impediment to that. So standard of practice 10-5 is realtors shall not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on, and then it's just the Article 10 protected classes, the 9 protected classes. Realtors shall not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs, and a cluster of related changes opened up the code to be applicable and enforceable against all a realtor's activities, not just real estate activities. And lest anyone go nuts thinking that means there's professional standards police that are sniffing around your bedroom, the only article that really lends itself to enforcement outside the confines of real estate is Article 10. So it is solely to open up the anti-discrimination article to be able to be enforced against people who engage in the absolutely soul-crushing, abhorrent, reprehensible behavior that we were seeing was really bubbling over last year. Not new, but was really proliferating last year.
And I think it's fair to say, if I saw a real estate, a real estate agent engaged in that kind of speech on Facebook or wherever, I'm not going to call them up. You know, it should be evident why that discourages someone in the real estate sale. So it's been interesting, just to hear the debate, as it developed. But that really, I think is ultimately, the test that many people of different backgrounds hearing that speech from a real estate agent will infer this person is not going to provide fair service to me.
Very true. Well, thank you for that, Matt. I know that personally I've noticed there isn't all of the disgusting posts that we were seeing last fall prior to this rule change. It was really ugly. And so I'd like to hope that we wouldn't have needed this, but the fact that we did, at least it has made a difference. Brian, can you tell us about the ACT initiative?
Yeah, so ACT, was an initiative that we launched January 2020, and it's really, just a couple of months after I joined NAR, and it was a couple of months after this New York Newsday story came out, where my emphasis was to identify those efforts that would provide for less discrimination in the real estate space. And I characterized the efforts as accountability, culture change, and training. And it's interesting when you think about any number of fields, I think those are the areas that you want to address. It happens to make a handy acronym, ACT, but I was just listening to a police officer in, I don't know what it's, Rochester, a woman who had been fired for standing up against police brutality and just recently won a lawsuit. And when she was talking about her efforts and what she's trying to change in the law, she effectively said the same thing, that that training was one part of it, but training's not enough. If you have a culture that allows police brutality or turns the other way or doesn't report it, that's a problem. And at the end of the day, when people engage in these things, there has to be real accountability. And so I think it applies many spaces. I don't want to compare these two spaces, but I'm just saying when you're talking about laws and following laws, people need to know what the laws are. That's effective training. People have to have a commitment to it, which is the culture. And then at the end of the day, there needs to be enforcement and some consequence. And so that accountability is key. And what we did was we said, all right, well, what are going to be game changers in these spaces? And for accountability, we said, well, look, a lot of real estate agents say that if they engage in discrimination, they could lose their license. But the reality is you don't see it very often. So we said, and in fact, if you look at some of the state licensing laws, some of them don't explicitly say that you could lose your license for a fair housing violation. It may say an ethical violation, or it may be implied, but some of them aren't explicit. So we said we need to identify what are the best provisions of a strong real estate licensing law when it comes to fair housing. And so we did some work behind that, and we shared with our association executives some of that. And we've already seen some association executives take some of that information to begin to change some of their state licensing laws to make them stronger on fair housing. We also said testing holds folks accountable, because the evidence is the strongest evidence you can find. And rather than have a newspaper, was it the Orange County Register, rather than have an Orange County newspaper expose discrimination in the community, why not have the brokerages get ahead of it and do their own self-testing? And so we said, let's work with testing experts to create a program. And we've done some of the preliminary work on this. This is a heavy lift. As you know, the New York Newsday expose cost them it's high six figures, and took 3 years for them to do. We're not doing something like that, but still to actually put together a testing program that people can tap into from different places is costly and resource intensive. But we're building this up from the ground, and it's, we already have a fair number of brokerages interested and some associations interested in working with us on this, because we can't be everywhere at once. So we're looking at some communities that we may focus on. I'm not going to share that, but self-testing is very helpful, and we want to get brokerages to be proactive and self-correct for these problems, rather than have government agency or private fair housing group or a newspaper expose it. So that's something that we're doing. And then beyond that, in terms of culture change and training, we said culture, agents learn from other agents. And very early on, I was just a couple of days onto the job when Newsday came out, and I saw that there were some companies that they had tested that did not exhibit discriminatory practices, where they had tested multiple agents multiple times, and while 10 out of 12 companies had some problem, these two didn't. And I thought, we really should highlight that. If you're working in the same market and you're doing well and you're not resorting to these things, what can you tell your peers so that they stop it? And so just this past week, we premiered these 3 videos from real estate agent leaders to highlight what people are doing in different communities. And that's something we're going to keep up. We're going to continue to highlight realtor champions on fair housing, because we think that is among the more influential things we can do. And then finally, training. As you all know, we launched something called Fairhaven, which was an innovative training tool using simulation to help people apply their fair housing learning. So rather than just have classroom training, we thought, take this and try to apply it to real situations, because that's where you really exercise your muscles and where you develop the muscle memory around fair housing. So these are just some examples. There's other training, like implicit bias training we've done. We're also doing a lot of work on how to help agents deal with questions about schools, which can often lead to the perpetuation of segregation. Agents provide inaccurate information about schools, or talk to people about schools based on the demographics of those. So there's a range of things we're doing in each of those areas, but they fall in those 3 general areas that make up ACT.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And, I'd like to emphasize that the Fairhaven simulation is really pretty genius. The fact that we can put ourselves in the shoes of the client is the best part, in my opinion, of that training. It's one thing to look at it from the agent's perspective, but to then have the simulator walk you through the client experience and ask you, well, what would you do if this happened to you, was really smart. So I enjoyed that very much and have been promoting.
My highest praise for Fairhaven is, when realtors think of training tools like that, I'm a cynic. You think, well, it's going to be cheesy. You know what the right answer is? Probably answer like what the flaming racist would not do. But it's much more nuanced than that. It's very, very good. And one of the types of discrimination that I thought, well, what kind of an idiot would do that? My wife, who's a Filipino immigrant, was just telling me, completely unrelated to this, it came up in a separate conversation, the exact type of discrimination that is one of the simulation models in Fairhaven has happened to her numerous times in the course of her work. I won't give it away. I won't do a spoiler, but it was like, geez, huh.
And I think what Fairhaven really underscores is the importance of being conscientious, right? That real life does not lend itself to cut and dried answers. So you have to be thoughtful and thinking and, trying to apply these concepts to how situations really present themselves. And as someone who, spent nearly 3 decades, enforcing the laws and working with the developers of this, I was really impressed with what came back, because it made me scratch my head. But it also, I think, underscored why I've done fair housing work for so long. There's always new scenarios that require, applying the same concepts, but trying to sort of work it through so that you can understand what the right thing is to do in a given situation.
Great. So we have a great question in the Q&A, and I'm actually going to ask Matt the question as a broker. So Matt, how would you coach your agents if they have clients that make racist statements? So what recourse might an agent have besides canceling a contract if they don't want to work with such a person? What do you suggest first?
Well, I mean, just to think out loud through it, obviously, if we as licensees, if we as realtors are doing our job well, we may be the best hope for getting an actual racist client to not be able to behave in a racist manner. We may be the basically the backstop to help ensure, because our easy answer to that is, I can't touch that discriminatory conduct with a 10-foot pole. And in fact, if you don't back down, I'll be duty bound to terminate the listing or to terminate the buyer representation. And I would offer a gentle explanation aside from that's morally reprehensible. Here's all the reasons I can't. But it's entirely possible that if we play our cards right as realtors, we can gently push back, get the client course corrected, and then, if it's now on my radar, I can be extra vigilant to make sure that I'm not smelling anything in this multi-offer situation where there appears to be anything that I can't defend in terms of a selection being based on actual substantive terms unrelated to any sort of demographic information. But brokers need to be ready to push back, because none of us wants to be associated with that, and frankly, none of us can afford to.
Right. That's...
And I do want to make sure, Lori, because I'm afraid it may throw you off. I typed a quick answer to somebody and it put it in the answered category, so I want to make sure you saw that that's still there to be answered.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. I think that was a great response. And here in California, back in October, we had a new form that was released. It's the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory Form, and it is attached to all of our contracts, whether you're on the sale side or a lease transaction. And I like to coach my agents to use that at the start of the relationship. It's attached to a contract, but you have conversations before you get to that point. And so this is, in my opinion, not a form to gloss over. It's not, hey, just in response to fair housing, here's a form to sign. No, this really spells out the laws, the different governmental agencies that are looking at this, all of the different entities that we as agents work with and within, whether it's our licensing body, our associations, including NAR, our MLSs. Here are all the things, here are all the ways that this is a problem. And oh, hey, by the way, seller, here are all the ways you can accidentally step into a situation yourself. And so it's a great form to start that conversation early and set expectations. So I wanted to throw that out there. Let me take a quick peek at what you mentioned. Let's see. So Tony asked, I have often stated
that's the one.
Be a much better place if all people were realtors. I feel that our profession leads to fairness and equality. Am I wrong? All right, Matt, what do you got?
So I totally respect where that's coming from. And Tony, in response to your question, I saw a lot of people that a lot of realtors on various online forums that responded very negatively to Charlie Oppler's very direct, very unconditional apology as the first order of business on the first day of his term. And the pushback was very much along those lines. What are you talking about? Realtors are the most fair-minded people I've ever met. We don't discriminate. How dare you impugn us as an industry with an apology that has subsumed within it a whole bunch of really nasty activities? And so what I would say is NAR, I believe, is partially a victim of its own success in modern history. My entire lifetime has been, years after fair housing was the law of the land, and my entire 23-year career has all been in the era where NAR was a genuine, authentic ally in the cause for fair housing. But what I would say is if you don't understand the history, and if you haven't studied the history, you really have no idea just how bad it was. And it's also very hard to fully understand how much hangover there still is today that directly is handed down from that. I'm constantly looking to curate my materials for DEI and fair housing related conversations. One I came across literally just in the last few days, an analogy that I had not heard from anyone else. Jason Purnell, an associate professor of the Brown School at the Washington University in St. Louis, he used a bathtub analogy. It is like leaving for work at the beginning of an 8-hour workday with your second floor bathtub water running full blast. It overflows all day long through your entire house, and passing the first law, outlawing the behaviors like coming home and turning off the water, but not fixing any of the water damage that's continuing to drip through the house and cause continued damage. And so I know that for people that look like me, it feels like the playing field was leveled before I ever got to the playing field. So why is this my problem? And I'll just say, when you study the history, it's really hard not to appreciate why we all share a moral imperative to do it. Housing discrimination isn't the reason people that I went to school with growing up, it's not the reason they've been shut out of housing. It is the reason, because of the deprivation of intergenerational wealth accumulation, that I didn't have to worry about whether my parents could send me to college, and they did. And so that's for somebody my age or younger, that is still very, very much in play. To succinctly summarize what Brian talked about earlier, the realtors as a group shut out Black brokers. They redlined Black neighborhoods. They shut money out of Black neighborhoods. That forced the Black neighborhoods into a downward spiral. They then shut Black people out of the new white suburbs. And then, to add even more insult to injury, they strategically built the expressways to further isolate and tear down Black communities, creating absolute entrapment. And the hangover, Chicago is in my home state. That's not where I'm from, but Chicago is in my home state. And there are a few places where the hangover effect is more persistent than it is there. You can't overstate just how bad the history is or how much it still influences today. So I completely respect where Tony's coming from. And as I said, it's because NAR has been a victim of its own success, which is a great thing. But speaking personally, the learning journey that I've been on, I have had my heart absolutely broken and am crushed by the realization I won't live long enough to see that damage undone. And so the best I can do is do everything I can for as long as I can to work to undo it.
And if I could say, I think Tony's right in the sense that certainly real estate agents have more training on this and probably much more awareness on this than the general public by just the nature of the business. There's laws that they are trained on. As I said with ACT, the question is whether people always follow through. And I think it's hard to quantify. Obviously a great number do, and I think that's maybe where Tony and other people come from. But we see from New York Newsday examples of people don't. And I tell people, I worked for almost 3 decades at a federal agency where we, enforced this law where we sued people day in, day out. And my friends, over the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division are suing people, all the time for housing discrimination. And so it certainly happens. I grew up in Queens, which is just adjacent to Long Island. And, my parents, when they bought in Queens in the late 60s, they were, asked whether or not Green was a nice Irish name. It was just commonplace. And I grew up with people just like some of the, who said some of those things that we saw on videotape. Maybe people don't think of that as pernicious. So I think part of the problem is many people may have in their heads a notion of what discrimination is, but what actually denies people sometimes is just silent steering, or where you offer some people some opportunities and don't others, consciously or unconsciously. So that's what the courts, that's what you're still seeing in the courts, that kind of discrimination. Only occasionally do you see something really blatant. but that happens too.
Such good information. So for each of you, as we're kind of wrapping up here with just a few minutes left, why is it important for real estate practitioners to take ownership of furthering fair housing, and what should they be doing? What can they do?
So again, I think there are sort of levels to this. Certainly, at the minimum, they should do no harm. They should make sure that they have a policy of equal professional service, which means being conscious about it. So it doesn't always mean literally, following a script with each person, but maybe having a mental checklist of all the things you want to cover with every person, so that you can guarantee yourself that you are not overlooking anything based on someone's background. I've interviewed and hired people over the years, and one of the things I've always made it a practice to do, even if I weren't reading from literal questions, was making sure I cover everything with each person, because if you don't, there's important information you could have elicited that you never would have known, and you could have denied someone an opportunity. And it's often because you go down these tangents with people, or you make assumptions about things, that you overlook things. Likewise, in all of my time as an investigator on fair housing issues, and I think police investigators will tell you the same thing. You gotta go through all the questions, because you will overlook something, and it actually can be determinative. And in the case of housing and sales, you could end up denying people something because you made an assumption or went down a road without asking the explicit questions or providing the same exact information to everybody. So I think that's first. But then beyond that, I think what Matt and I have said is I think everyone really should educate themselves on what's gone on in their community, because it would help them better understand why we're still talking about this. I know just north of you, the big international story has been this Bruce's Beach up in Manhattan Beach. Land that was African American land, and a very thriving community that the city of Manhattan Beach took away and condemned and did nothing for years. And now people recognize, yeah, that was unlawful and racial, and now they're returning that. But that was commonplace. That's how many of our communities developed, many of our resort communities. If you dig a little bit, you will discover, Hilton Head, all these places involve some kind of land taking like that. And so it's important for us to understand that foundation, because, it still operates in subtle ways.
Thank you for that. And Matt, I'll ask you the same question.
So I would actually, in direct response to what Brian just said, I want to remind people how the preamble to our code of ethics starts. And think about this set against that taking of that beach. Under all is the land upon its wise utilization, and here's the key phrase, and widely allocated ownership. Widely allocated ownership, and until pretty modern history, we'll just take it, just 'cause. This is still a big issue, and it's become almost cliche to say it's not enough right now to not be racist. You really have to be anti-racist. But I would say in our conversation today, the manifestation of simply being content to be not a racist is exactly where a lot of our colleagues in Long Island, and as we agreed, could have been anywhere when put under that spotlight from those hidden camera videos. Committing to being proactively, intentionally anti-racist, anti-discriminatory. And it's not just race. It applies to folks with disabilities in the LGBTQ community. I'd be remiss if I didn't say so. And religious backgrounds, and the entire list of protected classes. But it isn't enough, because if you look like me and you literally don't have a discriminatory thought in your head, I'm here to tell you from some really hard-learned experiences through some utterly transformative friendships, that doesn't mean that really awful things aren't still happening, and they just happen to be blocked by the blinders. So we still have super important work to do, and we've got a lot to make amends for. a lot of historical baggage. And I don't say that to be a downer. It really just needs to motivate people that it is up to each of us and all of us collectively to commit ourselves to making sure that we are zealously pursuing that right to access to real property by everyone.
Thank you for that. Brian and Matt, thank you both so much. I personally want to thank you for your commitment to this important conversation and all of the hard work that you guys have been doing, and the passion that you bring to it is inspiring. And so thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all of the work that you do and for sharing those resources and your perspective. It means so much to us. So really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. And thank you for having the conversation. We appreciate that you guys are leaning into it. Thank you.
We're trying.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, there we go. You can hear me now. Thank you so much.
And for those of you that are tuning in today, thank you for being here and for contributing to the conversation and sharing your time with us today. So please join us tomorrow as we will be hosting another session. Our professional standards chair from our local association, as well as our state and the federal levels, will be on to review the recently updated Code of Ethics, Article 10, Standard of Practice 10-5 that Matt spoke about. So visit the website. I know that we put the link in the chat. We've got a great week of content, so I hope that you'll join us throughout the week. And once again, Brian and Matt, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you guys soon.